Hello historians, welcome back to the channel. Thanks so much for tuning in. My name is Prof. J. I am your history professor. And in today's lesson we're going to be talking about society and culture in Europe during the High Middle Ages. First up, we'll take a look at the lives of both the peasantry and the aristocracy during this time. Second, we'll take a look at trade development in the High Middle Ages, centering on Italy, Northern Europe, and the fairs in France that connected those two regions together. Third, we'll explore how the growth of trade led to the rebirth of cities and towns across Europe, and we'll dive into the new culture that emerges in those urban areas. We'll also investigate the rise of universities and the role they played in a revival of interest in Roman law. Finally, we'll take a look at some new literature that's being written during this time period, including courtly romance and heroic epics, as well as the new Gothic style of architecture and its various characteristics. Without further ado then, it is time for history, so let's get rolling. Hello historians, welcome to History 101. Today's lesson will be on European society and culture in the High Middle Ages. For my current batch of students, as always, there's a forum that goes along with this lecture located in our course LMS, so please take a moment to access that forum now. For anyone watching that's not a current student of mine, welcome. Hopefully you'll learn a few things about Europe in the High Middle Ages. My students have likely had enough time to bring up the forum, so let's get to it, shall we? The High Middle Ages encompasses a period of roughly 300 years, from 1000 to 1300 CE. The plan is to split the objectives into two separate lessons, this one and the next one. In this lesson, we'll specifically be looking at social and cultural developments, while in Unit 10, we'll be staying in the High Middle Ages, but looking exclusively at political and religious developments. That means for this lesson, we're going to get away from the politics and religion and focus more on society and culture. Before we get into the details of today's material, it's important to note that there is no definitive moment when the early Middle Ages became the High Middle Ages. It's not like one day everyone across Europe recognized they lived in an era called the early Middle Ages, and the next day they thought to themselves, hey, I think we're in the High Middle Ages now. Rather, what distinguishes the two are general developments that take place within, roughly, certain years. For example, during Unit 8's presentation on the early Middle Ages, the central theme was power becoming decentralized. During the High Middle Ages, one of the main themes is power becoming more centralized between 1000 and 1300 CE. So even though we're still talking about the Middle Ages, we're looking at some general trends that were unique to this segment of the Middle Ages. One of the trends we notice in the High Middle Ages are changes in agricultural practices. A combination of warmer weather and more land being cleared for farms led to an increase in farm production, which could in turn sustain a larger population. In addition, heavy iron plows were developed that could break apart the thicker, clay-filled soils of northern Europe, allowing the land to be more easily farmed. A new type of horse collar and the invention of horseshoes also made farm work easier by allowing horses to pull plows and save villages a lot of manual labor. Perhaps the biggest change in agriculture, however, was the emergence of the three-field system. In this system, 1/3 of the land was planted with grains like wheat and rye, 1/3 was planted with legumes like different types of beans, and 1/3 was left unplanted, or fallow, to allow the soil time to recover so it could be planted the following year. The fields were rotated so as not to wear out the soil. A wider variety of crops was now grown, and the soil held out for longer. Agricultural tasks were still carried out by Europe's peasantry, both free and serf, living on manors and independent farms. The seasonal tasks associated with farming dictated peasant lives. The monotony was broken up, however, with dozens of church holidays like Easter and Christmas that gave people a respite from the tough manual labor they performed. The village church therefore served as a hub of not only religious but social activities for many villages in Europe. In addition to the religious holidays, it was the village church that brought people together for weddings, funerals, baptisms, weekly masses, and other events. The village church then played a crucial role in the lives of peasants. The homes peasants lived in were simple constructions of either wood or stone, depending on what resources were locally available. Houses usually had 2 rooms, one for sleeping and one for congregating. The roofs were normally thatched, and the structure was held together with mud and clay. Peasant women had numerous responsibilities, including having and raising children, making clothes for the family, tending vegetable gardens, cooking meals, and helping the men work in the fields. Peasant diets centered around bread, usually made from rye, supplemented by legumes, fish, berries, vegetables, nuts, eggs, cheese, and game from hunting. Ale was the beverage of choice for the poor, as water was often too dangerous to drink, and the yeast in ale killed off bacteria, making it a bit safer. It's time for our first review of this lesson, so let's highlight the main points of this section. First, one major trend of this period of European history was agricultural changes, such as new heavy plows and the 3-field system. Second, the village church was the center of religious and often social relations, and helped break up the monotony of peasants' working lives. Third and finally, peasant homes and diets were simple and straightforward, and peasant women played integral roles for the family. Free peasants and serfs spent their lives working the land for others, the aristocrats, who served as society's warriors, defending against foreign invasions and maintaining internal order. Aristocrats came to dominate all of the political, social, and economic power in society, and included everyone from the king down to the simplest knight. Due to their status as society's defenders, warfare and fighting made up the bulk of what aristocrats did during the High Middle Ages, leading them to be a violent group in general. The Catholic Church tried to limit this violence by instituting the peace of God and the truce of God. By the first, knights were to take an oath to not attack churches and non-combatants like women, children, and those on pilgrimage. By the second, aristocrats were not supposed to do any fighting on Sundays or on religious holidays. These were never hard and fast rules of conduct, however, and were easily ignored if some aristocrats found it to their advantage to violate them. The same can be said of the idea of chivalry, a set of unwritten norms that knights were supposed to follow, such as defending the defenseless, not attacking non-combatants, not attacking an unarmed knight, and fighting for glory only, not for profit. The idea of chivalry never truly reflected the reality of the Middle Ages. Tournaments were also used to control and direct the aggression of the aristocracy, although the church wasn't too keen on them. Initially, the only event of a tournament was the melee, in which a number of knights wearing armor and using blunt weapons would fight in a free-for-all. Later on, the joust was added, in which 2 knights squared off, mounted on horseback and equipped with lances, with the aim of dismounting the other. Tournaments were very popular entertainment during the Middle Ages, provided an outlet for the warlike nobility, and were a source of profit. Knights who yielded to another during the melee were ransomed back to their families. The English knight William Marshall made a fortune on the tournament scene, competing in dozens of melees and defeating 203 opponents. With the rise of knights and knighthood came a rise in castle production. Castles would serve as the homes of great lords throughout the Middle Ages, and also served as strongholds during times of conflict. Castles began as simple structures called motte and baileys. The motte was a mound of earth capped with a keep that was surrounded by a wooden wall called a palisade. Below the motte was the bailey, a small town that provided resources for the noble living in the motte. Over the course of time, castles began to be made out of stone and became larger and more elaborate, with protected gates and defensive features meant to protect against an attack. Although aristocratic women were under the legal control of men, first their fathers, then later their husbands, many women exercised a great deal of control through running the estate. Because men were often training for war, at war, or competing in tournaments, the lady of the castle or manor was usually left in charge of affairs. This meant aristocratic women had to organize a command servants, oversee the estate's finances, supervise potentially large numbers of peasants and serfs in fields, and possibly train young girls in estate management as well. Some women during the Middle Ages also became quite influential over their husbands, and the greater their husband's rank, the more people were touched by that influence. Eleanor of Aquitaine and Blanche of Castile were notable aristocratic women taking active roles in politics and military affairs. Girls were expected to marry young in order to maximize their childbearing years, so they had to begin learning what it took to run an estate at a fairly young age, as young as 12 or 13 years old. Often, a young girl was sent to another manor or castle to become a lady-in-waiting and be educated by the lady of the manor on everything she'd need to know upon marriage to effectively run a household. Boys, meanwhile, usually went down one of two paths. Either they would begin schooling for a life in the church, or they would be sent to another castle to learn the art of warfare so they could inherit their father's title and lands upon his death. Boys would be trained in all forms of combat and strategy, and usually served as aides to another nobleman while he took part in tournaments. Once a young man had completed his training, he underwent a special ceremony welcoming him to manhood and knighthood. During this ceremony, the new knight would be girded with a sword, and during much of the Middle Ages, would be slapped across the face as a symbol of the last blow he would receive without reciprocating. Later on, that part of the ceremony would become the stereotypical tapping on the shoulders with the point of a sword, which isn't nearly as cool. Marriages among aristocrats were arranged between families for mutual benefit. Men were not supposed to marry until they came into their inheritance, and therefore had the resources to provide for their new wives. But that did not always happen. This situation often led to great age disparities between husband and wife, with the latter being normally 15 or 16 years old, while the former could be in his mid-30s or even later. It's time for another review, so let's take a break and highlight the most important points of this section. First, the aristocracy, as the defenders of society, tended to be a violent group. Things like the peace and truce of God and tournaments were all designed to provide an outlet for their aggression. Second, castles were initially simple wooden constructions called motte baileys, though over time they became more complex. Third, those castles were often run by aristocratic women while their husbands were playing at war or actually fighting a war. This gave aristocratic women some real influence in society. Lastly, young women were sent to a castle to learn estate management and how to be a good wife, while boys were either sent away to learn fighting or joined the church. One of the most important developments of the High Middle Ages was the rebirth of trade, as well as the development of towns and cities across Europe. Let's begin by looking at trade. The Italian peninsula was the place where European trade began to make a comeback. It was well suited, jutting out into the Mediterranean Sea, and therefore able to access both Europe and the Byzantine Empire, and even linked to trade routes in the Middle East. Port cities such as Venice and Genoa were also well situated to engage in trade by sea, and were some of the first to create new trade routes to the east. In Northern Europe, trade centered on the region known as Flanders, the area of Belgium including important trade cities such as Ghent. Trade in the north centered around wool. Wool from England was imported to Flanders, where it was made into cloth, and then sold back to England, to the Scandinavian countries, and to other areas of Northern Europe. Nobles in France began to realize how lucrative trade was becoming and developed a clever idea to connect the two emerging trade zones of Europe. They began sponsoring large trading fairs at various points of the year and invited merchants from both Flanders and the Italian port cities to bring their goods to trade. The nobles provided protection to the fairs and charged rent for space and collected a tax on every purchase made. The fairs were located in the Champagne region of France and became so popular and generated such wealth that other parts of Europe established their own trade fairs in order to get in on the action. The growth of trade led directly to the growth of cities. Old Roman cities that had seen their populations dwindle after the fall of the Western Empire began to be repopulated. Merchants and artisans also established new towns, usually near castles, in order to get protection from the local noble. Nobles tried to establish control over these new urban populations, but soon discovered the rules followed by serfs and peasants did not often apply to merchants and craftsmen. These new populations needed a different set of rules and a few important liberties if they were going to work and trade. Towns could, and often did, purchase rights from the local lord, either through a one-time lump sum payment or via a yearly fee. For example, merchants needed the ability to travel freely so they could transport and sell goods. Trying to tie them to the land as serfs were was simply not going to work. So merchants would buy from the local lord the freedom to come and go as they needed to. Some lords were not willing to negotiate and sell rights, causing the townspeople to band together into communes and literally fight for rights they wanted. Some towns and cities even purchased the right to form their own local government, which usually consisted of a city council chosen from among the city's wealthiest merchants and artisans. Some cities would also establish an executive officer appointed by the council, usually called a mayor, who enforced the council's decrees. City councils were responsible for many things, including fire brigades, constructing warehouses to store goods, establishing weights and measures, and establishing watches to maintain order. Many Western European cities were still small in size, especially compared to cities in the East and some Muslim cities like Cordoba in Spain. Most European cities had fewer than 100,000 people, all crowded behind the city walls. These cities quickly became overcrowded, which made them breeding grounds for diseases and put the city at great risk if a fire broke out. In many cities, the population consisted of merchants, artisans, and craftsmen living in the floors directly above their shops. They often formed associations called guilds, which controlled the prices, wages, standards, and methods of production in their respective crafts. They also controlled who could become a guild member and the process by which a person did so. Most achieved the rank of journeyman, someone who has completed their apprenticeship and is now traveling from city to city, improving their craft and selling their wares for a living, but is not a guild member. Sort of like a Jedi who graduates from being an apprentice to being a Jedi Knight, but is not on the Jedi Council. Guilds became wealthy and powerful organizations within cities, often lending city councils money and engaging in building projects to show off that wealth and power. Let's pause here and review the material we just covered. First, trade began to increase in Italy due to its fortunate geographic location and shape, while in Northern Europe, trade centered around the area known as Flanders. Second, the growth of trade and trade fairs led to the rebirth of cities and towns across Western Europe. These towns often paid for or fought for certain rights and liberties they valued, such as the right to move around freely. Third, some towns purchased the right to form their own government, usually consisting of a town council and mayor. Lastly, craftsmen and artisans often formed guilds that controlled all the aspects of a particular trade. As society stabilized and people could begin specializing in things other than agriculture, we see important cultural developments taking place during the High Middle Ages. The university is a product of the Middle Ages. There were no universities in ancient Greece or Rome. In the early Middle Ages, education was controlled by the Catholic Church and took place in either monasteries or cathedral schools. As government organizations became more sophisticated, they needed skilled administrators who possessed more than a religious education. In 1158, the first university was founded in Bologna, Italy, to teach law to those hoping to enter government as a profession. In 1200, the University of Paris was founded. In 1208, Oxford in England was born, and a year later, some faculty and students moved from Oxford to found the University of Cambridge. Many of these initial universities were guilds of either teachers or students, meaning a guild of teachers would make all of the decisions regarding what the university would teach, what the graduation requirements would be, how to matriculate through the curriculum, how much tuition would be, how much teachers would be paid, and so forth. In some cases, student guilds would be the ones making those decisions. The university curriculum was made up of the 7 liberal arts: grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. Students could earn either a bachelor's or a master's degree, which were technically teaching degrees, though most did not go to university to become teachers. Doctorate degrees could be obtained in law, medicine, or theology, and usually required an additional decade of study. The students mostly came from merchant and artisan families of modest means. Then, as now, some students took their education seriously, while others did not. Universities often reflected the violent times in which they existed. Records can be found of violence between teachers and other teachers, teachers and students, students and other students, and students against the townsfolk, known as town versus gown conflicts. Eventually, universities banned weapons as a means to tamp down the violence. Universities served as the home for the revival of the classics, the study of ancient Greece and Rome. Europe, through the Muslims, rediscovered Greek thinkers in the 12th century. While numerous Greek philosophers, mathematicians, and physicians were eagerly translated and studied, Aristotle was revered more than any other, so much so that medieval scholars referred to him simply as the philosopher. Muslim scholars had not just translated the classics, however, they also wrote extensive commentaries that European scholars found invaluable. Europe also rediscovered the Corpus Juris Civilis of Justinian, which led to a revival of Roman law. Europe in the 12th century was a patchwork of different law codes, including manorial law, guild rules and regulations, church or canon law, as well as royal law from increasingly powerful kings. The idea of one comprehensive set of laws that governed everyone in a kingdom then became quite attractive. The rediscovery of classical learning and thought gave rise to a new philosophical school that was distinctly medieval: scholasticism. Scholasticism was an attempt to combine reason and faith. It sought to use reason and rational thought to try and answer important religious questions. Peter Abelard was a famous scholastic thinker who argued that doubt leads to inquiry, and inquiry leads to the truth. It was perfectly acceptable then, at least for Abelard, to question contradictions in the Bible and use reason to parse through them. That was, in fact, the very subject of one of his most famous works, Sic et Non, Latin for yes and no. The rediscovery of Plato and Aristotle also led to a revival over the debate about the nature of reality. Some medieval scholars sided with Plato that the world we see around us isn't truly real. One has to understand the universal idea behind the individual objects one sees, like apples. These scholars were called realists. Opposed to them were the nominalists, those who sided with Aristotle and held that the universal quality that made something what it was could be found in the individual objects themselves. So reality could be understood by studying your surrounding environment. They were called nominalists because they believed universal concepts were only names, which translates into the Latin word nomina. German scholar Thomas Aquinas held that the mind could grasp truths about the physical world around us, but in order to understand spiritual truths, faith was needed. Reason and faith, then, were two sides of the same coin. Both were needed to discover truth. Aquinas also argued that reason and divine revelation simply could not contradict one another, as each came from God, and God wouldn't contradict himself. There was also time for people to compose literature. The stories were increasingly being written in vernacular languages. The word vernacular is Latin for vulgar tongue, and refers to languages like French, Spanish, Italian, and German. More tales were being told in these local languages than in Latin, which was increasingly relegated to use only in universities and among some political elites. Vernacular tales took a variety of forms. Troubadour poetry was produced mainly by knights and aristocrats, and were usually love poems concerning some woman, real or imagined, who inspires the knight to be better and live an honorable life. Heroic epics dealt with war, battles, and honorable combat between chivalric knights. Courtly romances weren't just about romance, but were akin to the fantasy novels of today, the equivalent of Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter. They were stories that included wizards, witches, mystical forests, and talking animals. The last cultural development to discuss in this video are architectural ones. At the beginning of the Middle Ages, the dominant architectural style was Romanesque, consisting of barrel vaults, semicircular shaped ceilings, essentially, thick walls to hold up the incredibly heavy ceilings, and rounded arches. These types of buildings, especially Romanesque churches, were normally rectangular in shape and had few windows, as windows are weak points, structurally speaking, and the weight of the roofs would not permit many weak points. As we enter the High Middle Ages, a new architectural form comes into being, and will supersede Romanesque as the dominant style. Gothic style came into vogue in the 12th century, and included a number of innovations. Instead of rounded arches, Gothic cathedrals utilized pointed arches to better distribute the weight of the walls and ceiling. Rather than barrel vaults, Gothic style employs ribbed vaults to add extra support. Gothic cathedrals are also notable for their flying buttresses, structures built on the outside of the churches to help take the weight off the roof and distribute it to the ground. Flying buttresses effectively take pressure off of the walls, which can then be thinner and include more and larger windows. Those windows were decorated with beautiful stained glass, normally designed to tell the various stories of the Bible and Catholic faith to help illiterate churchgoers understand what the church wanted them to understand. The vibrant glass colors and size and number of windows allowed much more light to enter Gothic churches than Romanesque churches. Many people believed light was associated with God, so more light was a good thing. Gothic cathedrals were also constructed to be taller than Romanesque churches, with towering spires reaching hundreds of feet in the air at times. The interior of the church was also designed with high ceilings, the thought being the pointed shape and height would act almost as a channel for the prayers of the faithful, helping them reach the heavens. Gothic churches and cathedrals were time-consuming tasks, often taking 2 or more generations to complete. This means a community had to be quite dedicated to a project to complete it over the course of literally decades. And those who began building knew they likely would not see the building's final incarnation. Gothic architecture is therefore not only a wondrous example of medieval engineering, it also demonstrates the profound faith many people had during the Middle Ages. It's time for the final review of today's lesson. First, by the mid-12th century, we see Europe's first universities being founded. These institutions taught the 7 liberal arts, as well as medicine, theology, and law. Second, universities aided in the classical revival seen in Europe at this time, as scholars began reading Aristotle and Muslim commentaries about him. Third, scholasticism was a new philosophy attempting to reconcile reason and faith, and included such thinkers as Peter Abelard and Thomas Aquinas. Fourth, local languages began to replace Latin in literature as tales of chivalric knights and courtly love were written. Finally, a new architectural style, Gothic, with its vaulted arches and flying buttresses, replaced Romanesque as the dominant style. That does it for Unit 9. In this lesson, we learned about what life was like for both the peasantry and the aristocracy in the High Middle Ages, how society and culture began to change as a result of the revival of trade and urban life, and the role universities played in the cultural developments of the High Middle Ages. If you have any questions, as always, please leave them in the comment section below or send me an email if you're a student. If you'd like some more information about the topics covered in today's presentation, here's a short list of books you can check out to get started. Lastly, as always, be kind in the comment section, as only you can prevent flame wars. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you all again in the next video.